I am Jim Collison and live from the Gallup campus in Studio B, brand new Studio B here in Omaha, Nebraska. This is Gallup's Called the Coach, recorded on October 5th, 2018. Called the Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share our tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you have questions during this live webcast, we'd love to have you log into our chat room, just right below the video window down there. Bottom left-hand corner, it says log in. Choose the guest account. Put your name in where it says guest. Take those numbers out of there. We don't need those. Then hit submit, and you are in. You can also use any of the 17 social media platforms they make available to you. Love to have you in there, and especially today, we'd love to have your questions live. If you're listening to the recorded version or have questions about anything coaching related or anything really, if you just want to send us an email, best way to do that, coaching@gallup.com. Don't forget to visit the Gallup Strengths Center. Just gallupstrengthscenter.com for all your CliftonStrengths coaching resources and training needs. You can also catch the video and downloadable audio. We call that podcasting. All the cool kids are doing it these days. All that stuff is available for you on our coaches blog. Head over to coaching.gallup.com. Dean Jones is our host today. Dean is the principal architect of Gallup's global client learning strategy. We're going to talk about learning today. It's going to be awesome. Dean, welcome back to Called the Coach.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. This is going to be fun. This is going to be a good, interesting, meaty day of talking about strengths in organizations.
Yeah. Dean, one of the questions I get a lot from our coaches is about embedding strength-based culture in an organization. And I think when we think about learning and education, this is a step in that process of building a strengths-based culture. So I'm really excited to it. We've come off some great webcasts and some great webcast series here in the past. So if you're first time you're hearing Dean and you get through this and you're like, I need more Dean Jones, we have a whole playlist for you on YouTube. But Dean, as we think about embedding strengths in organizations, talk a little bit, a little bit about this. So let's talk through it today.
Yeah, I would say, gosh, this is a great topic and it's such a meaty topic. And I also promised Jim that we, usually like we do like 3-parters or 4-parters, or it starts to feel like, Harry Potter, like where there's 9 episodes, So, it just goes on forever and we get older.
Are you going to ever end this series?
So I want to make sure that in this one 50-minute session, we really we get a lot of meaty content here, right? I will tell you, I'll start maybe with a little bit of a story. It was a number of years ago, and I had been asked to join a meeting with a group. It was with a religious organization and a faith-based organization. And they had been very committed to strengths. They were very committed to engagement. And they said, gosh, we want to have a conversation about development. We want to have a conversation about learning. Can you join us in this group? And it was this great, great group of people. And they had a large number of parishes in the Pacific Northwest, and where they had implemented strengths, and they had done all kinds of great things to be able to do it. And it was this interesting thing for me. So we had this conversation. They started sharing all the things they'd done to make strengths available to people. And having people complete their strengths, conversations around it, sharing around it, the whole thing. And they said, gosh, we've done all this stuff, but what happens next? And it was this funny thing. And I said, well, what do you mean what happens next? And they said, well, everybody knows their strengths. What happens next? And it was this interesting thing. It really, for me, it was like one of those kind of key seminal moments where, for me, Jim, it was one of those things where it was like one of those moments like, oh, I get it. You don't know where to go from here. Right? Like, you don't know, and what happened for me, it was really funny. For me, it was just like, holy cow, you're just getting warmed up here. There's a whole world of what's next, right? But I could see they didn't really have access to that world. They hadn't really, it was like there was no door, to that. And the funny thing was, as I started to work more with organizations and more with coaches and more with HR leaders and OD people talking about strengths in their organizations, one of the things I could see was, in fact, that there were a lot of organizations that were in the same place. where they had said, gosh, it feels like we really know strengths. We've really rolled out strengths in the organization, but we don't know what to do with it now. Right. And so strengths was kind of this great thing where I feel good, you feel good. I know me, I know you, you know me, like the whole thing, love, 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 love. We all love each other, right? And we know each other. And the more we know, we love each other. And like, it's all good, right? And it's like, okay, now what? And the thing that's missing, I think, is a fundamental conversation about how strengths really is a business strategy. This sounds so funny to say, but if you said, hey, I'm going to, as a business strategy, I'm going to find the most talented people I can find, and I'm going to help them to be able to understand their own talent, right? And then I'm going to, once I've helped them identify their own talent, I'm going to then develop them so that they can really use those talents in meaningful ways and apply them to our mission, our purpose, and our business outcomes. And so that they would produce extraordinary results, right? That would be a business strategy that any private equity firm would say, wow, that sounds like the right thing, right? You should 100% do that. And in fact, that's really what strengths is as a business strategy, right? There is that piece where it helps us to really understand ourselves and helps us to understand others. But inside the context of an organization, when you think about organizational impact, it's really, you're only getting started at that point. So in a minute, I want to kind of come and be a little rigorous about it, but it's that point where you start after we all know our strengths, after we all know and we can share that. It's how do we start to apply that in meaningful ways around the things that we care about, what we're doing together as an organization, the mission that we have, the reason that we exist, our goals and outcomes as a function of that. That's when it actually starts to be really meaningful and where you see strengths really, really making a difference and where it becomes a tangible, powerful, impactful business strategy, right? So to be a little rigorous, I think that there's like this chasm, right? That for most organizations and we at an individual level, we talk in our courses about naming, claiming, and aiming our strengths. At an organizational level, I kind of want to, I'm gonna make it sound a little more OD, right? But it's basically naming, claiming, and aiming, right? So at the beginning, the first step really is talent identification, right? What are the talents that I know I possess? Right? By taking the assessment and completing the CliftonStrengths assessment, it helps me to be able to identify the talents that I have. And that's really the first step. The second step is what individuals would describe as claiming, which is we would describe in an organization as talent awareness and appreciation. So how do I help everyone become aware of their own talents and others' talents? How do I help them be able to appreciate their own talents and appreciate others' talents, right? So as we start to do that first piece, talent identification, then a talent awareness and appreciation. The challenge is in most organizations, that's where they stop, right? So all of the conversations, all of the work that is done around identifying your talents, becoming aware of them, appreciating them, helping others identify their talents, helping them become aware of them and us aware of them collectively, and then appreciating them. And that's where people get stuck. And so a lot of the exercises, a lot of the development is that way. A lot of the coaching is that way. And the presumption, I think, for a lot of it, I don't think there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually the foundation. It's the right thing to do in the beginning. The challenge is that I think the presumption is once we all know that and we become aware of it, it automatically then will impact the quality of our work. And to some degree, it does. Like we know from our meta-analysis that just by taking people through CliftonStrengths, you can get a 7% increase in employee engagement, right? So to some degree, that's not false. That assumption is not false. We just know that there are significantly higher impacts on employee engagement, and by extension, significantly higher impacts on business outcomes, when it's not just that we all know our talents and strengths and we're all aware of them and appreciate them, but we start to actually apply them against meaningful goals and outcomes that we share together, and that we start to point all of our development at developing strengths that then make us better at achieving those goals and outcomes. So after talent identification and talent awareness and appreciation, I think there's that third step, which I like to call talent application and development, right? How are we applying our talents against those outcomes? How are we starting to develop those? And I think that's the really key piece for folks, right? Is how do we start, as we work inside organizations, is how do we start to apply it there? Make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. That number, that 7% number, that's an engagement number, right? For folks,
correct.
Knowing that if they see the report, if they get the basic stuff, 7% lift in employee engagement.
Correct. That came out of our and we've published this on Gallup.com. That came out of our strengths meta-analysis that was done a couple of years ago. We know that with organizations that do where they take employees through CliftonStrengths, they will see typically a 7% increase in employee engagement. We know that in organizations where then they create an organization-wide initiative around it. So things like executive coaching and manager education and manager coaching and embedding it in rewards and recognition and making it part of their employee value proposition and creating heroes and doing storytelling around it, all the kind of stuff that you do when you build an organization-wide initiative, that the increase in employee engagement jumped up to 23%. And we know that employee engagement, the great thing about measuring employee engagement is it's tied to and predictive of key business outcomes. So things like profitability and productivity and customer metrics and employee retention. So there's a whole host, quality, safety, shrinkage. There's a whole host of other key business metrics that when you drive engagement forward that are tied to that. So measuring engagement is indicative of and predictive of the impacts in those other business outcomes. And that's why it's such a valuable metric. And that's why you can see the difference here. And the difference really is not just doing the assessment, but also doing the assessment and starting to do those things that I've just described as talent development, talent application, where we're starting to say, okay, we're going to develop people inside this, and we're going to make sure that now that we all know our strengths, we're starting to point them together at the right outcomes. Okay.
Dean, a lot of our coaches go in and they might do an initial strengths leadership seminar, right? Yeah. Whatever. And then, of course, there's people coming and going inside the organization and things are happening. And I know we're gonna talk a little bit about this, but when do we even move on? I mean, when is the right time to move on from the seminar and move into the leadership role?
Yeah,
from an organizational standpoint.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would tell you that one is there's kind of two answers to that. One is I think it's important to work with leaders right away. So I think that leaders ultimately need to get bought in to strengths early to CliftonStrengths early in the process. So oftentimes, CliftonStrengths is a grassroots movement. I was sitting with a very large organization the other day, and I just had almost like a funny conversation where this woman who was the executive who was in charge of kind of all their kind of human capital stuff said to me, she said, we were talking about an initiative we were going to do in their organization. And she said, and the decision-making process around it. And she said, this kind of funny thing. She said, look, we're either going to do it or it's going to happen on its own. There's so many people that have done CliftonStrengths. There's so much demand in our organization around this that we are either going to do this and manage it and control it and focus it and point it, or it's just going to happen on its own anyway. So it's almost like a foregone conclusion that we got to do something, right? So, which is really interesting. I think, to answer your question, early in the process always is great because it helps leaders to understand what this is. And I think one of the challenges is when you're working with leaders, particularly executive leaders, is that they care about different things than managers or individual contributors. That the leaders care about things like organizational impact. So when you're talking to a leader, you've got to be prepared to be able to say, hey, what's the impact on the organization and the organization's success by virtue of having done strengths? Leaders care about business models and strategies, right? How is this going to shape the organization's culture? How is this going to shape your business model? How is this going to become part of your brand with customers and impact the relationship that you have with customers? So you've got to be prepared to be able to talk about that and the impacts, those impacts. And then the things that leaders do. Now, certainly leaders manage other leaders in many cases, but a lot of a leader's role is creating a vision and being able to then translate that vision, communicate that vision in powerful ways to people in the organization. So a lot of helping leaders to be successful with strengths is, one is understanding myself and my personal brand and who I am as a leader through the lens of my strengths. But it's also then being able to think about, how is this going to impact our organization, and how do I incorporate that into the way I communicate about our organization to people inside and outside of the organization. So how do I articulate that? How does that facilitate it? How does it in some cases accelerate it? How does that part of our brand, our vision, the way that we work, our culture around that, right? So I think early on is great because you get leaders bought in and leading it. And then as you go through it, helping leaders to really be equipped so they then model the behavior, that strengths-based behavior as we go through it. So
yeah. It's as we think about moving forward with this, then, right, that name it, claim it, aim it, we've got also, as we think about embedding a strengths-based culture, we've got some steps. And I think a lot of times we get stuck, even I see the coaching community, they get a little stuck on the discover phase.
Yeah.
And we kind of keep going back to group sessions and seminars and stuff like that. Dean, walk us through, how do we get off that and really move into the ability to coach inside the organization?
Yeah. So as we look at embedding learning inside of an organization, we look at building a strengths-based culture. And remember, I know this sounds fundamental, but I want to make sure we're grounded. When I talk about a strengths-based culture, I'm talking about strengths, which is the ability to deliver consistent, near perfect performance in a specific task. So I'm talking about enhancing people's ability to deliver consistent, near perfect performance. So strengths, when we talk about strengths as a business strategy, we're talking about enhancing people's ability to perform and perform in a way that's consistent and near perfect, right? So when we talk about building a strengths-based culture, we're creating a culture that does that. When we talk about culture is simply, the way we define it is, how do we interact? How do we accomplish work around here? So when we talk about strengths being part of the culture, it becomes integral to the way that we interact with each other and the way that we accomplish work. So it's not something, and this is, I think, the challenge sometimes with strengths in organizations, it becomes something that we're doing on top of the work rather than something that becomes part of the way we work together. So part of the challenge, I think, is helping organizations embed strengths in the culture, so it becomes part of the way that we work and the way we get things done, versus that it's something we're doing in addition to and for fun on the side, or for something that's nice and a team building activity. It's no. It's actually the way we get things done. So we've identified 3 phases basically here, where we would say, hey, there's 3 phases of doing it. And why this is, I think, powerful is because you manage building a strengths-based culture differently depending on the phase that you're in. And the point that you made a moment ago, Jim, I think is a really good one, is oftentimes people kind of get stuck in that first phase. So the 3 phases are, the first phase is called discover. That's when we're creating a shared understanding of strengths and the principles and philosophies that define what a strengths-based culture is, right? So, and I'm going to go back and kind of talk about each one of these phases uniquely. So that first phase is kind of that discover phase, where we're building and we're creating that kind of shared understanding of strengths in the organization. The second phase we call embed. That's where you're turning strengths into something that's an integral part of individual behavior, team behavior, organizational behavior, where it really gets embedded in your culture. The third part is something that we call sustain. So that third phase is sustain. That's where we're reinforcing and we're building momentum, and strengths really becomes, it's so integral. It's completely embedded in the organization, and we're really using it as sort of a catalyst for accomplishing what we want to accomplish in the organization. So the thing that I think is challenging is in organizations, in each phase, you behave differently. And when you're coaching and leading in each phase, some of the activities that you do are different in each phase. And this is where I think, to your point, I think people get kind of stuck sometimes in that discover phase. So they continue to do those activities, or they believe that some of the activities we're doing in that initial phase are things that we're going to continue to do. So I want to talk a little bit about the discover phase, and then talk about some of the activities that happen in that discover phase, or make that discover phase really useful. So in the discover phase, a lot of that first phase is building awareness and encouraging participation. So a lot of it is building a lot of awareness, encouraging participation, getting people on board. A lot of what happens during that time is we're sharing the value of strengths and overcoming objections that people have. So there's times when it's like, hey, what is this? Is this something I really want to do? Is that intrusive or too personal? Is this really validated? What does this mean? How does this relate to everything I've ever done, like Myers-Briggs or DISC, or, like what does this mean relative to all that stuff, right? So we're introducing the language. And a lot of it is creating that kind of shared language in an organization. So it helps people we're introducing the language. And sometimes in the beginning, it's like, you just called me an activator. Should I be insulted? Should I be excited? Like, what does this mean? I don't know what that word is, right? And so we're introducing the language to people. You start to see people having those kind of transformational moments in this first phase, where you start to see people's perspectives shifting, and their perspective, their view of the world starts to shift. People start having big insights and epiphanies. Oh, I saw this about myself. I'd never seen that before. Oh, I saw that about our relationship. I'd never seen that before. Oh man, I really see this about our team. I never saw that before. Right? So there's in this phase, a lot of big insights and epiphanies. And, oh, that explains why we've never gotten this project off the ground. Or, oh, that explains why I've had friction in my relationship with so-and-so. And in fact, I mistook that for, what that person was trying to contribute. Right? So there are, lots of big insights that reshape the way we relate to ourselves, the way we relate to our teams, the way we relate to the work. Right? As a function of that, what you start to see people is assessing needs. Like, hey, you hear a lot of, we should really have that team do this, right? We should have that team understand their strengths at this level. We should start thinking about our work inside of a strengths lens. So there's a lot of sort of assessing needs and seeing new opportunities. Right? And a lot of the work that gets done in this phase, this is where strengths champions in the organization become really important. A lot of times you see organizations that are in a hurry to certify a bunch of coaches. And you need some coaches during this time, but you mostly need a lot of champions. So you need a lot of people, because this is the phase where there's a lot of advocating for, participating in, communicating about. There's a lot of how do we get the word out? How do we build awareness? How do we dispel misconceptions? How do we get everybody participating? So there's a lot of that. So there's a lot of, you see during this time, a lot of that. So, and to your point about leaders earlier, typically there are you notice there are key leaders. There's key sort of executive sponsors or key executive owners who are saying, yes, this is good. It's great when that's the CEO. Sometimes that's the leader of HR. Sometimes that's a line leader, a senior line leader in the organization who says, yes, this is what we need to accomplish what we need to do. So oftentimes there's senior owners and senior leaders that are sponsoring it or owning or advocating for it, right? So a lot of the activities that one does during this time are then oriented around awareness, communication, participation, right? So is there a communication plan? So creating a communication plan for the organization and tying strengths to the mission and purpose of the organization. One of the big things that leaders do, I didn't expect that we were going to talk about leaders so much today, but I'm glad we are, right? One of the big things that leaders do, I talked earlier about communicating vision and mission, right? One of the big things leaders do is they answer the question, why? And so using strengths to be able to answer the question, why are we doing this? Why is this important? How does this then impact our mission and purpose? How do we see that this is going to shape our culture? So leaders answering those questions as part of their role in rolling out strengths in the organization is really powerful and an important part of the overall organizational communication plan. This is a time when there's a lot of formal strengths education. So typically during this discover phase, there's a lot of formalized learning opportunities. So this is the time when it's like, I'm going to a course, right? So I'm going to go do a CliftonStrengths discovery session, or I'm going to an information session. This is the time where you want a lot of formalized learning opportunities. So, and part of what you're out to do is, we always encourage people to kind of do the trifecta. This is the virtuous kind of holy trinity of CliftonStrengths, right? Not, and I don't mean that in a sacrilegious way, right? But do the assessment, get some basic strengths education, and have a personal feedback session. So that is sort of the trifecta that gets somebody set up to really win with CliftonStrengths. Have I done the CliftonStrengths assessment? And somebody asked, I think, John, you asked, no, it was Chris that asked the question about in chat about the new reports. The new CliftonStrengths 34 report, even more robust than it's ever been, going to be fabulous for people. So doing the assessment and getting that new, fabulous, robust, powerful report. Then getting some basic strengths education, and our new strengths, CliftonStrengths introduction modules are going to be so powerful for people as a way to do that. Oftentimes it means going to some kind of formalized learning opportunity where I go and I find out about, it kind of is my education about the world of strengths, my own strengths. It really just kind of brings me into that world. So that basic strengths education is super important. And then the third is that I sit with somebody who is a qualified coach or champion or advocate who can help me just understand my profile. And a lot of it is that kind of basic stuff that we teach in the accelerated course and in the advanced strengths coaching course, where it helps me just to become aware of my own talents and strengths, be able to really own them for myself, be able to appreciate them, and then be able to start to point them at the things that matter to me. So lots of formalized learning opportunities in this phase. The other thing that happens in the discover phase is we start to look for, how do we keep the language of strengths present and visible in the organization? So a lot of organizations have done what Gallup's done, where, outside my office or my cubicle or the place where I work, my top 5 or my top 10 are posted. There's posters throughout the organization with the theme descriptions and that kind of stuff, right? We have spawned a whole cottage industry of mugs and banners and framed pictures. Yeah, exactly. There you go.
Yeah, a mug right there.
There you go. Look at that. So, but the intent is at this stage is, how do we keep that language of strengths present and visible? Because it helps people be able to learn the language, right? And start to traffic in the language. And during this time, people are spending a lot of time like, oh yeah, that strengths thing, I think I'm a realtor. You know what I mean? Like, oh no, this is what I am. And, I can't even tell you, it's like a number of people who've said, I remember the first 4, but I don't remember the 5th one, right? And that kind of stuff, right? So there's a lot of that kind of stuff. There's also then, during this phase, a lot of helping people start to share strengths. So we've talked about this, I think, in the prior series that became a trilogy for us, right? But helping people share strengths one-on-one, in teams, and organizationally, right? So starting to be able to share strengths in meaningful ways. And this is where you start to see it, where people say, it starts out and they just sort of to share their top 5 or their top 10. They start to be able to say, oh, I'm activator and therefore this means this. Or tell me what your top 5 are. Oh, what's that one? I don't know what that one is. So it's creating a lot of breadth and depth, right? A lot of understanding all 34. So I've got all 34, starting to go deep to say, okay, competition, that means you want to win. What else does it mean, right? I don't really know much beyond that. So breadth and depth, right? And this is where we start to see people do get certified as strengths coaches. people also get equipped oftentimes in organizations as champions. And we won't talk about that so much today. That's actually probably a good session for another time, is what's the difference between a champion and a coach, But inside of organizations, I think that there's champion really is for most of us sort of a way station on the way to becoming a certified strengths coach, right? But it's somebody that really can advocate for strengths and start to equip strengths and connect people to resources and promote strengths in an organization. So that's sort of the world of Discover, right? Anything about that, Jim, for you, or anything that's in chat relative to that?
No, I think, Dean, really important that that coaches kind of measure against that, like, where am I at in this and what are we doing? And that I think you would say too that those things continue to still go on, maybe in a smaller, maybe more directed, that you're doing new employees, or that they get an onboarding process to catch people up who are coming in. And then there's some kind of continuous process going on. But the effort really, if it needs to start to move as we think about these next two steps, once you get the blast going, then you really got to take your effort in the company effort to these next two steps. So let's talk about those.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think as I've done this with our clients, and as I've done this in like I talked about this at the summit, it does become a diagnostic of sorts. And what's interesting is that as people will say, hey, we've been in this discover phase for a long, long time, and it feels like, hey, how do we start to move out of that? And other people have said, gosh, I think we're beyond that, but there's some things that we never really nailed in that discover phase that we got to pick up now. And so I think, to your point, it is, and when you say strengths coaches assess kind of where they are, I think it's where the organization is, right? And so that the strengths coach that is working with an organization is helping that organization to be able to say, hey, where are we in this process, right? And where are we, because this is an organization, this is not a personal journey so much. We talk about that more in some of our other coursework, and particularly the advanced strengths coaching course. This is more the organizational journey of where are we as an organization. So the second phase is embed. And this is really the phase where it's kind of like, it's what I was talking about earlier, where we all sort of know our strengths and we share that, and we've talked about it. We've had some great formal learning opportunities. This is the piece where we're really starting to point it at our business outcomes and make it part of the culture of the organization. So we would say that what starts to emerge is sort of a shared awareness of CliftonStrengths and their utilization. So there's a shared awareness in the organization of strengths and their utilization. And one of the things that kind of happens just naturally there is it doesn't take as long to get people up to speed on strengths as it did in the beginning. And that's because when somebody, like, you mentioned onboarding a minute ago, when somebody joins the organization, strengths is sort of starts to be part of the organization. So you still need some formal learning opportunities, particularly for the new folks, but it's starting to be this thing where people hear about it and are learning the language. And it's not just in the formal learning opportunities where they're learning the language, but it starts to be part of the team. It starts to be sort of embedded in the team. And that starts to be really important, right? Embed also is a lot of formally getting strengths in our human capital processes. So that's a big piece of this phase. And by our human capital processes, I always tend to focus on kind of 4 core human capital processes. How is it as part of bringing people into the organization? So that initial onboarding, as part of kind of recruiting and hiring, right? How is it part of that? We don't use CliftonStrengths as a selection instrument, but once somebody has been selected to as somebody to hire in the organization, it's part of their onboarding through the organization. Then their development, right? So how are we developing people to be able to meet the expectations of their role? The way we engage people, and we all know that CliftonStrengths, or we, if we don't know, we could know that CliftonStrengths is a catalyst for employee engagement in an organization. And the last piece is performance management, the way we manage people's performance and give them feedback and coach them so that they're more successful in delivering on the role that we've hired them to do, right? So in this embed phase, a lot of it is really thinking intentionally intentionally about how are we integrating strengths formally into those human capital processes. So how is it as part of our onboarding and bringing new employees in the organization? How have we integrated it with our development? So how is it part of our management development? How is it part of our leader development? How is it part of the way that we develop people inside the organization, right? How's it part of the work that we do around engagement in the organization? So as we sit and make action plans about how we're going to create more engagement on our teams, how are we using that as a way of shaping our plans around that? And then how is it included in our performance development processes or our performance management processes? One of the things you see a lot in this phase is there's a conscious application of talents and strengths to produce results. So that's one of the things that is markedly different from the earlier phase. In the discover phase, it's a lot about awareness and appreciation, sort of building that, getting people on board, everybody's on the team. What you start to see in this embed phase is we're intentionally using strengths to accomplish results. And we think about it in a really intentional way to be able to say, how are we pointing our strengths at producing results? So things that happen during this phase are often things like people saying, hey, we've got this team goal that we want to accomplish. How are we going to use our strengths to be able to do that? And so how are we going to apply ourselves in a meaningful way that way? The other thing that you see happening in this embed phase is more kind of ongoing feedback and increasing levels of trust around that. So strengths becomes a powerful feedback lens. One of the things I often tell clients is on an organizational level, CliftonStrengths is so powerful because it's a shared language that is positive and constructive that managers can use to talk about individual differences. So it turns up, it helps us to be able to communicate, hey, you're different than me, I'm different than you, but it does it in a way that's positive and not a value-based way, right? It's not like if you were more this way. It really honors who each person is and at the same time allows us to be able to talk about individual differences in a way that's positive and constructive, right? So that language becomes more the culture and there's more feedback around that, right? The other thing you see, and this is a marked difference in this phase, there starts to be a widespread recognition that there's many paths to performance. So even though you and I, Jim, might have the same job, the way we do it may be different. And you see less of that thing in organizations. In organizations that are not strengths-based, it's kind of like if we could only get Joe to do it this way, then he'd be successful, right? There's more of a recognition that we expect the same thing of Joe as we do of Jim and Dean. And we know that each person is going to do it uniquely based on their talents and their strengths. So there's more of a widespread recognition that there's many paths to performance. You also start to see in this phase more visibility of strengths around values, recognition, and awards. It becomes more of the kind of culture of recognition in the organization. Hey, and I mean sort of formal recognition, but also informal recognition. Hey, Jim, like we couldn't have done it without using your deliberative in that meeting, right? We would have missed a ton of stuff if you haven't really shared your perspective around that. And so we really appreciate your deliberative talent around that. So I think there's more of that visibility of strengths in that stuff. You also see that one of the things that happens here is oftentimes in the discovery phase, the ownership for strengths is sort of owned by a narrow group, right? And it's sort of, and they're championing it like that. You can say, oh, you can name them all, right? What you see is the core team around strengths expands, right? More leaders start to emerge around it, more people that are advocating on behalf, the kind of core team expands. So some of the activities that you see happening in this embed phase is there's a lot of focusing on equipping managers to use strengths for individuals and team conversations. This is the place you really want to go to work on managers. And this is where you start to really need coaches because coaches are the resource for managers. So you really want to go to work on equipping managers during this phase. You want to make sure you're tying strengths to things like job shaping, helping people shape the job, the way they approach the job to the expectations of the role. You want to make sure you're tying strengths to things like goal setting and performance management strategies. You also start to, during this phase, make sure in a really formal way that CliftonStrengths is included in onboarding and in the initial role training for people inside the organization. So there's intentional effort. The formal opportunities are still there, but they're fewer and far between because you've got most of the organization up and running here. But you want to make sure as people come into the organization that it's integrated into onboarding and role training. This is typically when that happens. You want to make sure also that the strengths development activity that is happening shifts at this phase. So in the beginning, it's more like, I know me, I know you, right? And the development starts to be at this phase, tends to be pointed at deeper level concepts like theme dynamics, right? And at team blend kind of sessions. So how are we accomplishing the work and where are we getting hung up as a team? How do I know how my strengths combine together to enhance my performance? So it's much more performance oriented, much more pointed at goals and outcomes and key kind of performance things that individually I have and that we have together as a team and as an organization. So it's much more oriented around that. You also see during this phase, as it starts to gain momentum, strength gets integrated into the performance management processes, which include things like expectation setting, coaching and feedback, development reviews, all that kind of stuff, right? You really see that. You also start to see that during this time, and you can hear it in what I've said, the resource network for the organization starts to get like that scaffolding of resources starts to get built out. So there's coaches, there's trainers, there's champions, there's job aids online, right? So inside the organization, there's so much around that, right? So that's kind of the embed phase. I want to just talk about then the sustain phase. So before we wrap today, this final phase, and I will tell you, in all the time that we've been working on it, I haven't just there are companies, I will tell you 100% that are in this phase, but there are not a ton of them. Right? There's a lot of them that have done discover and kind of like got stalled. So it's more in common than not that an organization says, hey, I just don't think we're quite there at sustain yet. So in the sustain phase, this is where strengths becomes a community norm, right? So in this third phase of sustain, strengths becomes a community norm. It's more just part of the community. And how you see that is new members to the community, new people in the organization get socialized very quickly. It's a funny thing. People always talk about Gallup, like people do strengths as part of their onboarding at Gallup, and we do have formal education for new folks around that. But a lot of the real socialization around strengths happens just in people trafficking in their team meetings and the work that they do. It's not, like a lot of times people have come to the basic strengths education, that they get in their first few weeks, and they already know what their strengths profile looks like. They've already had lots of conversations around it because they've talked to their manager, they've talked to their team members around it. People have asked them around that. So what you see in the sustain phase is new people just get socialized really quickly around it, right? So there's still formalized education, but it's not the driving need that it was in that first discover phase. You also see that it's harder to point to, even though there's lots of support, there's lots of coaches and champions, it's harder to point to, oh yeah, this is the person that's driving strengths in our organization, right? There's sort of the godmothers and godfathers of strengths in the organization, like, oh, Brenda started it here, and like that, or, Jose was the person that, got us interested in strengths. More like those are the people that got us started, but it's now kind of everywhere, right? So it's less about, you can still see organizations where you can still point to like, hey, if Jane left, we'd be in trouble. Right? That's how you're not really in the sustain phase, right? Because when Jane leaves, strengths leaves, you're not there, right? You're still working on embedding, The thing that you see in that sustain phase is ongoing shared learning in the community. So the learning is more informal learning. There's a lot of informal learning that happens where people just teach each other. Right? So people go through and they're just using the tools they've got to teach each other. And the learning, again, there are formal learning opportunities, but they're by far eclipsed by the informal learning opportunities. So lots and lots and lots of informal learning opportunities. You see in this phase lots of very visible strengths heroes and advocates and mentors everywhere. There's more like strengths is in the folklore of the organization. So in the stories we tell about our heroes and our leaders and that kind of stuff, right? But you see the thing that is really the hallmark of this phase is strengths has transcended individuals, systems, and processes. Like if an individual leaves, strengths is still there. If a process gets changed, strengths is still there. If a system gets updated, strengths is still there, right? So it transcends all of that to become part of the culture of the organization. And there's a sense of ever expanding awareness, ever expanding growth, ever expanding impact in the way that we're using strengths. So a lot of what you see that organizations do with learning at this time is a lot of the focus is informal learning. So making tools readily available, supporting sharing, supporting a lot of peer feedback and teamwork. You're really up under managers and developing managers at this phase, and you're really providing lots and lots of resources for helping managers have impact in the organization. Strengths has been integrated into all development. So no matter what we're working on from a development standpoint, in some ways it's all sort of strengths-based training. There's lots, all the kind of developmental feedback and developmental coaching happens via a strengths lens. So we're never trying to make somebody into something they're not. Right. So you don't see conversations like if you were just more like Jose, right, then it'd all turn out. So all that developmental feedback and coaching is happening through a strengths lens. There's lots of communities of practice in the organization. So there's lots of communities of practice around coaching and managing and leading courses and mentoring others through strengths. And you see a very clear, one of the coolest things and most powerful things is strengths is tied to the organization's identity as a whole. So it's tied to the organization's purpose, the organization's brand, the organization's culture. You see it embedded in the values. It's part of the external brand of the organization, and it's integrated into the organization's employee value proposition. So you really see it across all of that, right? So that's really what sort of describes the sustained phase. So let me stop here, Jim. I know there's some questions there. I know some folks, I'm seeing the chat's been kind of lit up here. Let's talk about some of the questions people have around this. Okay.
I want to ask you before we go to the questions real quick.
Yeah, please.
Coaches come ASC, they may even take advanced coaching. We get them ready for the name it, aim it, claim it, working with individuals, maybe even teams.
Yeah.
What else do we have to offer? How else do we help as coaches or even managers in these organizations are thinking about, I need help making this more sustainable. Chris Raines asked, hey, what does Gallup do around recognition? And we have a dynamite recognition program. So how can we help in these embed and sustain phases? What kind of offerings do we have for that?
Yeah. One of the things that we have, so we have a ton of offerings, right? So I think one of the things that, and I don't want to take the time to rattle them off now, but I think one of the things that's really powerful for people, if you're a strengths coach, one of the things I strongly encourage that you do is do the advanced strengths coaching course, because I think it gives people more. We never intended the accelerated course to be the end all be all. Right. And there will be a point where we'll have an advanced strengths coaching certification that people should go for. Right. I think the advanced strengths coaching course gives people a deeper understanding so they listen in a more substantial way around it. I also think you want to make sure that you're equipped to help organizations. A lot of where strengths coaches are working right now is in that discover phase, providing strengths education. I also think that some of the tools that we've done, that we've made available through Called to Coach and through our education, through courses.gallup.com around engagement are very useful for people. And I think strengths coaches bring a very unique lens to that, where they can help tie strengths and engagement together for organizations. Right. And I think as we continue, we have a lot of courses out there. I don't want to talk about all of them right now. We offer a lot of management education. We also have a ton of tools that we sell and provide around this. I would tell you, I think people very much underutilize the tools that we've got in the Strengths Coaching Kit, particularly like the Coaching and Managers and Teams Kit. I don't think people have as much scratched the surface around it. We also have the Leading High Performance Teams Kit, which you can either buy in a digital format or a physical format that we sell, which is incredibly powerful at helping managers to be able to master all this, right? So lots of tools. We probably could just do a session on all the tools and courses and stuff that we've got. I know sometimes it comes across like shameless self-promotion, but we have this whole ecosystem of stuff that we can really equip people with. I also think, and this is going to sound like another kind of funny resource, but if you haven't been reading the articles that we're posting on Gallup.com, man, I get caught up, right? Because we've built this engine at Gallup. There's a gentleman named Scott Miller who has built this phenomenal engine of content, and working with our experts and our subject matter experts and our folks that are working throughout the organization. So if you just go to Gallup.com, there's a ton of articles there that are great to read. They're also a great tool to share them with the organizations and the leaders that you're coaching. And that is a great free resource that you really want to be able to take advantage of, right?
I think it's the best kept secret sometimes in our coaching community. I have to tell people, where did you get those stats? And I say, Gallup.com. Like, and they're going to go, duh. Yeah. Like, but there are that is, I think for coaches, that's mandatory or required reading. Subscribe to it, figure out how to get it automatically, print it if you have to, do whatever it takes. There's a lot of forward thinking that's going on there. And you'll sound super smart at work. Yeah. Dean, one of the linchpins of making this sustainable, I think, is around recognition. And I think a lot of organizations go right to the education, or they go right to the strengths exercises or the team activity guide or some of the things we have. And yet I think the secret weapon in this is recognition. Can you talk just a little bit about how we do that and some of our thoughts on recognition?
Yeah, I can. I would tell you that, I agree with you. I think recognition is an important vehicle, right? And because it helps with recognition a lot in organizations. What you're doing is reinforcing behavior. I think people get recognition and reward or awards collapsed together, right? And they're actually two different things. You want to keep your rewards and awards for legit performance, right? So there's nothing, it's become almost a joke about people getting participation ribbons, right? But you really want, one of the things that attracts and retains high performers in an organization is to know that there is a reward and there is an award and recognition for performance in the organization. And that performance is measurable, and that we care about a high bar of performance. And it's better not to hand out an award than to hand out an award for performance that's mediocre, right? So we really want to make sure that we're doing that. Part of that, though, embedded in that is, how are people using their talents and strengths to be able to do that? So as we tell the story of that performance, that strengths is part of that, right? And that strengths is included in that. So it's like, hey, what are those unique talents? And certainly we want to use the language of CliftonStrengths. That's a powerful tool, but it's not limited to that, right? It's like, hey, your ability to understand data and interpret it was phenomenal. And it really uncovered some insights that we just didn't see before. And it was one of the things that led to us making changes that were incredibly powerful for our organization and resulted in this accomplishment, right? And so weaving that conversation about where we're talking about strengths as the access to being able to do that, so that people are looking from, hey, what is that strength, right? The other piece is recognition. And I that's why I think it's important to parse it out, is it's great to spray recognition on everybody. I think it's great as people accomplish things to be able to say, hey, look, let's make sure we're recognizing people's effort, people's accomplishment, people's contribution. Because there's one of our workplace consultants who always says, teamwork makes the dream work. And and we have a thing here. I think, Jim, you've talked about it. We on a monthly basis here in the Omaha Riverfront, we do a big company-wide rewards and recognitions celebration. And there's lots and lots and lots of people that get recognized for their valuable, measurable contributions to our success, right? At all levels of our organization. And so that's super important. And that's a really important piece. I will tell you another thing that is super important is creating a culture of peer recognition. A lot of times we think of recognition as something that only is going to come from a leader or a manager. And if you want to have a culture of recognition, you got to create a culture where people are recognizing their peers. And again, you want how it relates back to creating a strengths-based culture is what people are recognizing is talent and the success and strengths, right? And I want to make sure I'm making, gosh, I really see the talent in you. I just want to recognize your ability in that arena is really important. But I'm recognizing strengths. I'm recognizing your consistent, near perfect performance in a particular area, right? So the way you've used that talent to deliver on outcomes. And when you recognize a strength, remember, you don't really have a strength unless you got a result. Right? Unless you've got consistent near perfect performance, unless you got results like that, that's not really a strength. But so when you really recognize strengths, that's powerful for reinforcing it. The last thing I want to say about this, sorry, you kind of opened up the
I like it. Keep going. I think this is the linchpin, by the way.
Yeah. I think it's one of them. Yeah. I think the piece with recognition is around recognition that's so important is making sure that again goes back to the diversity of talents, the diversity of strengths in the organization, right? And making sure that it's not just, sometimes in organizations, it's like, it flattens out where it's like, if you're competitive or if you're analytical, I've been in software organizations, right, where it's all about being analytical. And nothing else seems important other than being analytical. I've been in sales organizations where it's all about being a hard gun and competitive person, right? And nothing else seems important if you're not competitive. We want to make sure that as part of the way we use recognition and reward in the organization, that we're capturing the diversity of talents, right, that contribute to that. Right. So I think that's important. I don't think it's and I do think it's one of the key things organizations can do. I think, creating heroes around that, I think, is an important piece. Telling stories around how people use their strengths to be successful, super important. I think making sure, one of the key things, earlier I caught one of the questions here, right? And we're probably not going to get to all the questions, but one of the questions I had earlier, now I can't find it, was, it was Andrea's question. Andrea, I thought this was a great question. Are there certain characteristics of organizations that make it to that sustained phase? And are they public companies or private companies or certain industries like that? There's not those kind of, no, there's not like a type of company that is more disposed to be strengths-based, which is, I think, the good news. It's not like only public companies can be strengths-based or only companies in certain industries can be strengths-based. Every organization can become a strengths-based organization. Now, there are certain things that they have done that you see in common, where they've got great leadership support. They early on had strong formal education that they cascaded through the organization. They had that scaffolding of coaches. They were intentional about investing to embed strengths in their human capital processes. So they as Jim rightly pointed out, they made it part of recognition and reward in the organization. They supported, a big thing is they made sure strengths was the lens for managers in the organization. So there's certain common things that we can say that are generalizable strategies where we would say, if you do these things, you are more likely to become a legitimately strengths-based organization, right? So,
Dean, we are at the end of our time. I know you say teamwork is dream work, but I say Dean work is dream work. Always great to be with you here. Any final thoughts as we wrap it up?
No, just that here's the thing is I think coaches have a great opportunity to share the message of what it is to become a strengths-based organization. So I think every coach is working with people in organizations, is working with organizations themselves, working with organizational leaders. I think part of your job is not just say you personally can use your strengths or you can use your strengths with your team, but to start to create, I think, for organizations, the possibility, the opportunity of becoming a strengths-based organization. I think the more you can talk about that, like what would it be if your organization was a strengths-based organization? I think the more that you create the value of that for people in organizations, and the more they get that vision of a strengths-based organization, I think that helps really accelerate everything we're doing around the movement of strengths.
We did it, Dean. No part two. And
no part two.
Hopefully, the good news is you can go back, and there was a lot of information here. And we encourage you to go back and take some really good notes and work those through. Of course, we're here for you. Don't forget about the resources Dean mentioned. Courses are available at courses.gallup.com. You want to look into those. If you have questions, you can send us an email on any of this, coaching@gallup.com. We'd love to kind of help you through this process if you're thinking about embedding that in your organization. We'll remind everyone to take full advantages of all the resources we have available. I mentioned the main place to go right now, GallupStrengthsCenter.com, and that new 34 report is coming out here on October 24th. So we are just 19 days away from the new report. It'll be out there before you know it. Actually, by the time we publish this, it'll probably be there. So head to the GallupStrengthsCenter.com and look at that new 34 report. It's going to be dynamite. A lot of work went into that and a lot of intelligence in there. You're going to want to take a peek at it. I want to thank you for joining us today. If you haven't joined us in the Facebook group, about 12,000 of us out there, facebook.com/groups/called2coach. Great way to just kind of stay up to date on everything that's going on, including these resources that are available. I want to thank you for coming out today. With that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.